The barn was on fire, and it had been burning for less than 10 minutes when Nora Holt, who had arrived at Harlan Ranch that same afternoon, who had been on the property for fewer than 6 hours, who had not yet been shown where she would sleep, ran straight into the smoke. She was 26 years old, wide through the hips, heavy on her feet, and nobody standing in that yard had ever placed a single coin on her doing anything worth remembering. She had come off the back of a supply wagon in the early afternoon with a canvas bag on her lap and a face that gave away nothing, and in the hours since her arrival she had cleaned a kitchen, lit a cold stove, started a pot of beans, and introduced herself to exactly 4 people, none of whom had asked her name twice. But when the barn went up, she ran toward it. Not the slow, creeping kind of fire that gives a man time to think. The fast kind. The kind that takes the roof in under 3 minutes and turns everything underneath into a single roaring throat of orange and black. The kind that makes grown men take 3 steps back without deciding to, because the body makes certain decisions before the mind catches up with them. Every man on the Harlan Ranch stood at that safe distance, watching, waiting, doing the particular kind of nothing that comes when a situation outgrows what a person is willing to risk. Every man except her. Nora Holt ran straight into the smoke, and she did not stop. She came out the first time dragging a calf, a red and white bull calf that weighed more than anything a woman her build should have been able to move through heat and falling timber. She set it in the dirt, turned around, and went back in. She made 3 trips in total. When it was done, every animal in that barn was standing in the yard, breathing hard in the cold night air, and Nora was on her hands and knees in the dirt, pulling air into her lungs, and the barn was gone. Nobody said a word to her. Nobody offered water. Nobody said her name. Cade Harlan stood at the far edge of the yard near the water trough, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a line she could read even from that distance, even through the smoke and the firelight. He was looking at the burning structure with the expression of a man who has absorbed so many blows over so many months that one more, even a significant one, registers as weather rather than catastrophe. In his right hand, he held a folded piece of paper. Nora did not need to read it to know what kind of paper it was. She knew that particular fold. She had seen it before in another yard, held by another man who had run out of ways to make the numbers work. Bank paper. The kind that arrived without warning and left a person standing in their own yard, holding something they did not know what to do with. She straightened up. She looked at Cade Harlan for exactly 1 moment, the way you look at a landscape you are trying to memorize, and then she walked back toward the house to wash the smoke off her hands and start the coffee because the night was not finished, and neither was she. The notice had been tacked to the community board outside the general store in a town called Drywater on a Tuesday 3 weeks before she arrived at Harlan Ranch. She had walked past that board every day for 4 days without stopping. She had learned over the years, since she lost everything, the particular arithmetic of hope that looking too long at something you want costs more than it saves, and that the distance between reading a notice and standing at the end of a long road with nowhere left to go is shorter than most people expect. On the 5th day, she stopped. Harlan Ranch, Harlan County, seeking a woman of capable hands and steady character. Duties include cooking preservation work, general domestic labor, and livestock assistance as needed. Room and board provided, wages paid monthly, no prior references required. She read it twice. Slowly, the way a person reads something that might change their life, and is not yet certain whether that change will be good or devastating. No prior references required. That was the line that held her, because Nora Holt had no references. She had no family left to vouch for her, no former employer who remembered her name with any particular warmth, no pastor willing to write a letter of good standing. What she had was 2 strong arms, a back rebuilt by years of work that had asked more of it than was reasonable, and the kind of desperation that looks from the outside almost exactly like calm. She pulled the notice off the board. Nobody tried to stop her. Decker drove the supply wagon. He was a wiry man. Somewhere past 60, smelled like leather and wood smoke, and had the quality of a person who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He kept his eyes on the road for the first hour and let the horses do the thinking. Somewhere past the second creek crossing, he looked at her sideways. "You know who Cade Harlan is?" "I read the notice," Nora said. "That ain't what I asked." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. The land was flat here, scrub and pale grass stretching in every direction, the sky pressing down on it with the particular weight of a Texas summer that had gone on 3 weeks longer than anyone wanted. "I know he's a rancher who needs help," she said. Decker made a sound low in his throat. He had 61 head of cattle at the start of spring, got 33 left, lost his 2 best ranch hands to the railroad in the same week, and his foreman nearly quit in April. He paused, adjusting the reins against the pull of the horses. "And his cook walked out 3 weeks ago and hasn't been replaced." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Why'd the cook walk out?" "Because Cade Harlan," Decker said carefully, "is not an easy man to work for. Is he cruel?" "No." Decker shook his head once with conviction. "No, he ain't cruel. He's just exacting. Got a way of looking at a person that makes them feel like they're not quite measuring up even when they're doing everything right. And he don't talk much. Some folks find that unsettling." Nora looked out at the flat land moving past them. "I don't need him to talk." Decker glanced at her, really looked at her the way an old man looks at something he wasn't expecting to find interesting. Then he turned back to the road. "No," he said quietly. "I reckon you don't." She smelled the smoke before they crested the hill. Not the crack of active flame, the fire had been going for some time by then, but the thick, acrid ghost of something burning badly. When the wagon came over the low rise and Harlan Ranch opened up below them, she saw the barn structure, fully involved men standing at the safe distance in the yard, and the particular quality of stillness that comes over a group of people watching something they cannot stop. Decker pulled up. He started to say something. Nora was already climbing down. She landed and walked toward the fire, and she did not hesitate, and she did not look back. 3 trips, every animal out. When it was done and she was kneeling in the dirt, getting her breath back, Decker had pulled the wagon forward and was calling out to Cade Harlan, who was walking toward them from the far side of the yard, with a steady, unhurried stride that she would come to recognize as simply the way he moved through the world without urgency, without waste, without anything that was not necessary. He was tall, built the way the West sometimes built men, not through any deliberate effort at impression, but through years of physical work that had stripped away everything decorative and left something functional and hard. Dark hair a little long over the collar, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, eyes the color of dry summer grass and approximately as warm. He looked at her the way someone looks at a fence that needs mending, not dismissive at all. She had been on the receiving end of dismissive enough times to know it immediately, and this was not it. This was the look of someone taking inventory, calculating what a situation would require. "You answered the notice," he said. "I did." "You've done preservation work before?" "Yes. Salt beef lard, rendering dried fruit smoked pork if you have the setup for it." "Livestock." "My family ran a small operation before." She stopped, restarted. "I know cattle well enough." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked past her at Decker. "She'll take the room off the kitchen," he said, and walked back toward the burning structure without another word. Decker leaned down from the wagon seat and handed her canvas bag down to her. He was almost smiling. "Told you, he don't talk much," he said. The kitchen was a revelation, not the good kind. Pots left unwashed long enough to have formed views about it. A dusting of flour on the counter dried into a pale crust that cracked when she touched it. A side of bacon left uncovered past any reasonable point of recovery. The fire in the stove was cold, and had been cold for some time. She could tell by the quality of the ash and the temperature of the iron. Nora stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She had the kitchen clean, the fire lit, a pot of beans started, and the bacon dealt with before the sun had moved 2 full hands across the sky. She was not rushing. She was not performing for anyone's benefit. She was simply working the way she had always worked, steadily, without drama, moving from one problem to the next. Because problems did not fix themselves, and standing around thinking about them accomplished nothing. She was elbow deep in bread dough when Boone Garrett came through the back door. He stopped when he saw her. He was older, somewhere in his middle 50s, built like a man who had been doing hard physical work his entire life and had no particular feelings about it either way. With a face like saddle leather, left through too many seasons, and eyes that processed the world the way a good working dog processes a field completely without sentiment, missing nothing. He looked at the clean counter, the lit stove, the pot on the fire. Then he looked at her. "You must be the new one," he said. "Nora Holt. Boone Garrett." He did not offer his hand. He tilted his chin toward the pot. "What's in there?" "Beans. Salt pork once they soften. Cornbread coming." She glanced at him. "When does the crew eat?" "Morning, noon, and sundown, though there ain't much of a crew left." He paused. "2 boys and me. And Cade when he remembers to come in." "Does he forget to eat?" "He forgets everything that ain't the ranch." Boone moved to the window that faced the yard and stood there not saying anything, looking out at the wreckage of the barn. The silence between them had weight to it, not uncomfortable but loaded. The silence of a man deciding how much to say to someone he hadn't yet taken the measure of. Nora worked the dough. "How bad is it?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she looked up. "Bad enough," he said. Flat, without self-pity. The way men like him reported trouble as weather as fact as something that simply was. Dry summer, water running low, cattle dropping weight with no feed reserve to build them back up. Lost the Dawson contract last month because we couldn't guarantee the numbers. He stopped. "And now, the winter hay's gone," Nora said. "All of it." She shaped the bread into the pan, pressed it level with her palm. "Was it an accident?" she said. "The fire." Something shifted in Boone Garrett's face, just slightly. The way a man's expression shifts when a question lands somewhere he wasn't expecting it to land. "That," he said carefully, "is the right question." And then he walked out of the kitchen without explaining what he meant by it, and Nora stood at the counter with her hands in the bread dough and turned that sentence over in her mind like a stone she had found in an unexpected place. That is the right question. Not yes. Not no. The right question. She filed it away and went back to work. She served lunch to 4 men who barely looked at her. Arlo and Finn, 19 and 20 at most, wearing the hollow look of young men who had been up all night and were covering their uncertainty with appetite, ate fast and kept their eyes on their plates. Boone ate slowly and said nothing. Cade came in last, sat down and worked through a full bowl of beans and 2 pieces of cornbread without appearing to taste any of it because he was reading a ledger with the focused attention of a man for whom the numbers on those pages were more urgent than anything else in the room. Nora refilled his water glass without being asked. He did not acknowledge it. She went back to the kitchen. She was not offended. She had worked in enough houses on enough properties in enough difficult circumstances to understand that acknowledgement was a luxury and not a guarantee. She had not come to Harlan Ranch to be appreciated. She had come because she needed wages and a roof, and because the notice had said no references required, and because she was 26 years old with nothing left to lose, and she had learned in the hard, specific school of watching your family's land taken from them that when you have nothing left to lose, you might as well go straight at the hardest thing in front of you. She was washing the noon dishes when she heard the voice from outside. Not Cade's voice. A different one. A stranger's. And it had a quality that put her immediately on alert, the way certain sounds in a field put livestock on alert before a person even registers what they've heard. Smooth, controlled. The voice of a man who had practiced sounding reasonable until it became automatic. She did not stop washing, but she listened. "There are parties interested in this land, Harlan. Serious parties with real resources, willing to pay a fair price." A pause. Cade's voice flat and contained. "The land isn't for sale. Everything is for sale at the right number. You know that as well as I do. Not this." A short silence. Then the stranger's voice shifted register, becoming almost friendly, which made it worse. "I'm only saying, given how things have gone these past few months, it might be worth sitting down and having a serious conversation about your options." A man in your position, I know my position. Do you... A pause, heavy with something she couldn't name from inside the kitchen, but could feel through the wall like a change in pressure. Because from where I'm standing, you're running this place on stubbornness and prayer. And neither of those pays the bank. Silence. Long and tight. Get off my land, Vane. The voice, Vane, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Of course. My apologies for the intrusion. A deliberate pause. I'll be in the area for a few more weeks. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. Footsteps, a horse. Then the silence of an empty yard. Nora set the last bowl on the shelf and stood still in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about what she had heard. She thought about what Boone had said that is the right question when she asked about the fire. She thought about the losses Cade had absorbed over recent months. The contract, the hands, the fire. The cook leaving, and now a man named Vane who wanted to buy the land and was confident enough in his position to frame it as concern rather than acquisition. The shape of something was becoming visible. She didn't have all its edges yet, but shapes don't require their edges to be clear before they become real. That evening she carried the supper coffee out to the porch where Cade was sitting with the ledger across his knee. She had decided somewhere in the quiet of the afternoon that paying attention was the only currency she had to work with right now. And paying attention required proximity. He looked up when she set the cup on the rail beside him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The hands get their own." "It's no trouble." She turned to go. "Holt." She stopped. "Where'd you come from before this?" She turned back. He was looking at her directly, that inventory look, but with something new running underneath it. Something that might in another kind of man have been called curiosity. "Moved around," she said. "Worked a kitchen outside of Harding for 2 years. Laundry before that. Family farm before that." "Family farm where? East of here? It's gone now." He held her gaze. "Gone how?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Drought. Then debt. Then it wasn't ours anymore." She paused. "I know what the end of a thing looks like, Mr. Harlan, if that's what you're trying to find out." Something crossed his face. Not pity, which she could not have stood, but something closer to recognition. The expression of a person who has lived inside a particular kind of difficulty and can identify it without being told what it is. "That ain't what I was trying to find out," he said quietly. She waited. He looked back at the ledger. The land had gone quiet with evening distant cattle, a light wind through the dry grass, the creak of the porch boards releasing the day's heat. "Supper was good," he said finally. "First decent meal this kitchen's produced in a month." It wasn't much. By any reasonable measure, it was not much at all. But she had learned over 3 years of roads and difficult rooms to take the weight of a thing from its substance and not its size. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen in the warm dark and let herself feel it, that small, stubborn flicker she had been carrying for years, like a coal in a coat pocket, keeping it alive through sheer habit before she put it away and went back to work. She was up before dawn. The work required it, but that was not the only reason. Sleep had come lightly and left early, and something she had noticed the previous evening in the last long light, looking out across the land from the back doorway, had not finished being thought about. She made the fire, started the coffee, and stood in the back doorway while it heated. She looked at the land. It was dry. Visibly, almost painfully dry. The kind of dry that accumulates across months and leaves its mark on everything. The grass in the near pasture was the color of straw rather than green. The creek she could see at the far edge of the property was narrow and slow, barely moving in its bed. The cattle she could hear beyond the fence sounded thin. Not just underfed, but diminished in some qualities she could identify, but not fully name. But Nora did not stop at the surface of things. She had grown up reading land the way her father had taught her to read it, not as scenery, but as a document. A record of what had happened underground and above it over years and decades, written in the language of slope and drainage and the places where water chose to move and where it chose to stop. Her father had been a man of almost no formal education and extraordinary practical intelligence, the kind of intelligence that does not come from books but from decades of patient attention paid to the physical world. He had taught her, before everything that came after, to look at land, the way a doctor looks at a patient, not for what it shows on the surface, but for what the surface is telling you about what is happening beneath. She stood in the doorway and looked at the Harlan land, the slope of the terrain, the direction of natural drainage, the places where the soil color shifted from pale exhaustion to something darker and more complex. And there at the base of the low ridge to the north, maybe a quarter mile from where she stood, she saw it. A vein of darker color running along the foot of the ridge, deeper and richer than the bleached ground surrounding it on either side. A slight depression in the earth, a thin line of scrub vegetation growing just slightly taller than anything around it, drawing on something the rest of the land was not drawing on. In the middle of a drought that had been grinding this county into dust for the better part of a summer, that ridge was holding something. Something underground, something the surface was concealing or protecting, or both. She did not say anything about it. Not that morning, not over breakfast, not during the day's work. She was not the kind of woman who spoke before she was certain, and she was not yet certain. She only knew it was worth a closer look, and she knew she would have to go out there herself. She asked Arlo at noon while she was cutting cornbread whether there was anything along the north fence line that needed checking, a water point, a storage site, anything she ought to know about for planning the kitchen. Arlo was 19, gap-toothed and earnest, with the quality of a young man who had not yet learned to be suspicious of questions. He pointed her in the right direction without asking why she wanted to know. She told Boone she would be walking the north side of the property that afternoon to get her bearings on the land. Boone looked at her for a moment. It's a long walk in this heat. I've walked longer. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and went back to what he was doing. The ridge was farther than it looked. The day was hot in the way of a Texas afternoon in a dry year heat coming down from directly overhead with no shelter offered and no apology made. By the time she reached the base of the ridge, her dress was soaked through and her feet ached, and she was breathing in the measured way of a person managing their body through discomfort they have chosen. She stood at the darker patch of earth. She crouched down. She pressed her palm flat against the ground. Cool, distinctly, unmistakably cool. And beneath the baked surface crust, when she pressed her fingers in slightly, she felt something that had no business being there, a faint, give a slight moisture that the surrounding ground was completely without. She closed her eyes. Water, she thought. There is water here, not at the surface. Deep, 8 feet 10, possibly more. But it is here. It has been here. The certainty was the kind she had learned not to dismiss. Not built from logic alone, though logic could explain it. Built in her by years of watching and listening and paying the kind of attention most people were too hurried to sustain. She opened her eyes. She looked at the ridge, at the angle of its slope, at the old fence line running east to west along its base parallel to the ground. She stood on a long line of dark posts sagging slightly with age wire, repaired and re-repaired until the repairs had become part of the original structure. This fence was not Cade Harlan's work. It was older than him, older than his father, most likely. She walked to the nearest post and looked at the ground around its base. And she understood. The posts had been driven deep, the way ranchers had done it in earlier decades, when the measure of a fence was how long it would outlast the man who built it. 8 feet down, maybe 10. Straight through whatever lay beneath the surface without thought for what that surface might be concealing. Straight through a subsurface channel. Straight through a natural water vein that had been moving along the base of this ridge since before anyone put a fence here or a name on this land. And over the years and the decades, as the ground settled around those posts, the disruption had spread, had compressed the channel walls, had blocked the natural movement of water that had been making this journey long before anyone was here to observe it. What was downstream of that blockage, the eastern pasture, the creek, the troughs, had been slowly, year by year, starved of what it needed. Not by drought alone, not by bad luck, by a fence that nobody had thought to question because it had been there so long it had become part of the landscape itself. Nora stood at that fence line for a long time. Then she walked back to the ranch house. Cade was in the yard when she returned, talking with Boone in low voices near the water trough. Both of them looked up when she came through the gate with her dress dusty and her hair coming loose from its arrangement. Cade's eyes moved across her from head to foot, that inventory look, and settled on her face. "Where have you been?" he said. "Walking the north pasture." "That wasn't part of the arrangement." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She stopped in front of him. She was tired and hot, and she had walked a considerable distance in difficult conditions to confirm something she now felt absolutely certain about. And the certainty was sitting inside her, like a stone-solid, immovable, real. She said it clearly and without hesitation. "I think you have more water on this property than you know about, and I think that old fence line along the north ridge is the reason you can't get to it." The yard went quiet. Boone did not move. Cade looked at her, and something behind his eyes shifted the way a fire shifts when a draft finds it. Something working there, running through the implications of what she had just said. "You walked my fence line," he said. "I did. To check a supply question. I may have been curious about more than that." A silence. Boone made a sound that lived in the same neighborhood as a laugh, without quite being one. He covered it immediately. Cade did not look amused, but he did not look dismissive. He looked at her with that assessing look of his, and something in it had shifted, had moved past inventory into something that did not have a clean name. "Come inside," he said. "Show me on the map." She followed him into the house, and something about the quality of the day, the heat and the distance she had walked, and the weight of what she had found changed just slightly. Not fixed, not resolved, but different than it had been that morning, which for now was enough. The map was old. Cade spread it across the kitchen table, holding down one curling corner with his coffee cup and another with his closed fist. It was a surveyor's map, hand-drawn in the early days of settlement, the ink faded to pale brown, in places the paper soft with the fragility of something folded and unfolded over too many years. Boone stood to one side, arms crossed, watching. Nora leaned over it and studied it the way she had studied the land, quietly, carefully, without speaking before she was ready. "Show me where you were," Cade said. She put her finger on the ridgeline, traced it east along its base to the point where the old fence ran parallel to the slope. "Here," she said, "the soil color changes, darker than the surrounding ground even in this heat, and it's cooler when you press your hand against it, noticeably cooler than it should be." He looked at where her finger was. "That land has been dry as long as I've owned this property. Then something changed, or something is blocking it." She pulled her hand back. "When was that fence put in?" Cade looked at Boone. "Before my time," Boone said. "Before his father's time, most likely. Old construction. Deep posts." "How deep? 8 feet? Maybe 10. That was how they did it back then. Drive them to stay." Nora nodded slowly. She looked at the elevation markings along the ridge, at the way the contour lines suggested a gradient that would have once directed water along the base of the ridge toward the eastern portion of the property. A channel. Not dramatic, not a river or a creek. A steady, quiet underground movement of water through porous ground, the kind that sustains a property across dry years if it is left to move as it was meant to move. Until something stops it. "Water finds its path," she said. "If you block the path long enough with something driven deep through the channel, through the substrate, it backs up. What's downstream dries out, not all at once. Over years it looks exactly like drought." The kitchen was quiet. Cade stared at the map. "You're saying a fence built before I was born might be strangling my water table." "I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying it's worth looking at." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying I've seen land behave this way before on my family's place. Land that had been producing and then stopped, and nobody could explain why." She let that sit for 1 second. "We didn't figure it out in time. I'd rather you looked and proved me wrong than didn't look at all." He stared at the map for a long moment. Then he straightened up and looked at Boone. Tomorrow morning, we ride the North Ridge. Boone nodded once, the way men like him agreed to things without elaboration, without theater, as though the decision had been made, and this was simply the confirmation of it. Nora turned back toward the stove because supper still needed finishing. "Halt," Cade said. She turned. He was looking at her. That assessing look shifted again, adjusted by a careful hand. "You come too," he said. She nodded and went back to the stove and kept her hands hidden from both of them because they were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something that lived in the same region of the body as fear and was only distinguishable from it by the direction it pulled. They rode out the next morning in a line, Cade leading Boone to his left, Nora on a steady older mare that Boone had saddled without being asked, Arlo trailing behind. Finn had been left to watch the cattle. Nora had not been on a horse in 2 years. Her body remembered before her mind did the shift of weight, the rhythm, the way you stop fighting the motion and let it carry you. The mare was patient and unhurried, which suited her. When they reached the fence line, Cade pulled up and looked at it the way he looked at everything, with a stripped-down attention that held judgment in reserve until it had enough to work with. He dismounted, walked to the nearest post, and crouched down to look at the soil around its base. Nora dismounted and went to where she had stood the day before. She pressed the toe of her boot against the ground, still cooler than it should be. The difference was subtle to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but it was there. "Feel the ground here," she said to Boone. He crouched beside her, pressed his palm flat against the earth, lifted it, pressed again. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, One syllable from Boone Garrett was worth more than a paragraph from most men. Cade walked over and did the same, held his hand against the earth, and held it there long enough that Arlo, watching from horseback, craned his neck to see what was happening. Cade stood up. He looked at the fence, at the long line of it running east-west along the base of the ridge. Something was working behind his eyes. "If we're wrong," he said, "we pull a fence that didn't need pulling. We lose 2 days of labor." "Yes," Nora said. "And if we're right," she met his eyes, "if we're right, you get your water back." A long beat. Then Cade looked at Boone. "Get the tools." They pulled the fence the following morning, all 4 of them working from first light with iron bars and muscle, and the focused silence that comes over people doing something that matters and knowing it. Nora kept water and food coming and watched from close enough to observe without being in the way. She catalogued every post that came out of the ground in her body rather than in writing in the part of her that stored physical information the way dry earth stores heat. The 7th post. She knew before they pulled it. Something in the way the earth around its base sat differently compacted in a way that spoke of pressure from below, not just the weight of the post pressing down. She did not say anything. She waited. When the post came free, the hole it left was wet. Not damp. Wet. Dark and gleaming at the bottom, the way a wound is dark before it opens. Arlo made a sound that wasn't a word. Finn dropped to his knees and put his hand into the hole and pulled it back with mud on his fingers and stared at his own hand as if he were holding something sacred. Boone looked at Cade. Cade looked at Nora. She did not let herself smile. Not yet. There was too far to go. But she held his gaze for one steady moment and then looked back at the hole. "Pull the next 3 posts east," she said, "and 3 more west. Give the channel room to open." Nobody questioned it. They pulled the posts. By midday, the water was moving, not rushing, nothing so dramatic. A slow, dark seep that widened steadily as the earth adjusted to pressure it had been carrying for decades finally being released. It moved east along the natural slope of the land, following a channel that had been there long before any fence, long before the Harlan family put their name on this ground. Cade stood at the edge of it and watched it move. Nora stood beside him. She had things she could have said, practical things, how long before the eastern troughs would feel the difference. She said none of them, because this was his land, and his water, and his moment, and some things need to be felt before they can be discussed. "My father broke this ground by hand," Cade said. He was not talking to her exactly. He was talking to the ground or to whatever version of the past had decided to show up that morning. 40 years ago. Told me it was the best piece of land in Harlan County. He paused. He was right. Nora said quietly. He looked at her then. The morning light was direct and unsparing. It showed the exhaustion in his face, the dust in his hair, the particular rawness of a man who has been standing at the edge of losing something for so long that the possibility of not losing it hasn't yet fully settled. "How do you know about the fence?" he said. "About what it was doing?" "I didn't know," she said. "I thought I saw something. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "I was certain enough that the cost of being wrong was less than the cost of saying nothing. That's not the same as knowing." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then Boone called from 30 feet away that the eastern flow was picking up, and they both moved toward the work that was still waiting. The cattle found the water before noon. That was the thing about cattle, they knew. You didn't have to lead them to it or show them what it was. Something in them recognized water, the way starved things recognized food, and the first one that caught the scent changed direction without any human guidance, and the rest followed with the particular purposeful urgency of animals that have been wanting something for a long time. Arlo laughed out loud when it happened. A young, unguarded laugh that he probably would have been embarrassed about if anyone had commented on it. Nobody did. Finn was grinning wide enough that it looked like it might stay. And Boone, whose face had the emotional expressiveness of weathered timber, put his hands on his hips and shook his head slowly, which Nora had already learned meant satisfaction. Cade watched his cattle drink. He stood apart from the others with his arms crossed, and he watched his cattle drink. And Nora watched him watch them. She thought about how a person carries something for a long time, a failing ranch, a drought that won't break a man working systematically to take what little remains and what it does to the body when even one small piece of it starts to lift. She went back to the house and started supper. And for the first time since she had arrived, the kitchen felt different that evening, fuller, louder, the boys talking over each other, Boone contributing the occasional dry observation that made everything funnier than it already was. Cade came in last, as always. He sat down. He looked at his plate. Then he looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words said the way he said everything directly without ornament. From Cade Harlan, 2 words meant more than most men's speeches. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The water's moving. That's the beginning, not the end." He almost smiled. Such a small thing, the faintest adjustment at the corner of his mouth. But she caught it, and it stayed with her longer than it should have. She found the calf on the 6th morning after the fence came down. Or rather, Arlo found it first. He came through the back door at first light with a face gone white and a voice that had lost about 5 years of its age in the space of whatever he had just seen in the East Pen. Nora was at the stove. She read him before he finished his first sentence and was already moving Coat from the hook across the yard through the gate. She reached the pen before Cade did. She went straight to the animal and crouched beside it and put her hands on it the way her father had taught her, reading temperature, reading the quality of stillness, reading the particular language that a body uses to tell you how long it has been gone and what kind of going it was. She knew within 30 seconds. This was not drought. This was not starvation. The calf was underweight, as all the Harlan cattle were underweight, but underweight animals did not die this way. The stiffness was wrong. The way the body had settled was wrong. The eyes were wrong in a way she could not have fully described to someone who hadn't spent years watching animals live and die in every way that animals do, but that she felt with complete certainty was wrong. Cade arrived. He stood on the other side of the animal and looked at it, and his face went absolutely still. "When?" he said to Arlo, who had followed. "Sometime in the night. Finn found him at first light." Cade crouched beside the calf. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood. "Remove it, and check every animal in that pen before you do anything else today." Arlo went. Cade didn't move. Nora said quietly, using his name, Cade. He looked at her. "That's not how an animal dies from drought," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't. We need to check the water trough in that pen, where it's pulling from, whether anything has gotten into it." His jaw worked. "You think someone? I think we should check the trough before deciding what to think." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he walked toward the east pen, and she walked with him, and they checked the trough together in the early morning light, without speaking. Cade reached into the sediment at the bottom and came up with a residue on his fingers, faint, oily, with a chemical quality that had no business being in a cattle trough. Not mineral, not organic. Something introduced. He straightened up, put both hands on the top rail of the fence, stayed very still. The trough in this pen pulls from the east line, he said, half to himself. The pipe runs open along the fence for a quarter-mile before it hits the holding tank. Nora looked at the fence line, at the direction it ran toward the eastern property boundary. Something was coming together in her mind, a shape assembling itself from pieces she had been collecting without quite knowing she was collecting them. She walked to the gate and looked along the east fence line toward the property boundary. She looked at the angle of the pipe entry. She looked at the distance from the road. "How much of that pipe runs exposed along the boundary?" she said. Boone, who had appeared at the pen gate behind them, moving with the silent efficiency that she had come to accept as simply how he operated, said, "Quarter-mile, before it hits the holding tank." "So, someone standing outside the property line," Nora said slowly. "On the roadside of that boundary fence could reach the pipe without ever setting foot on your land." The words landed in the silence of the pen. Cade looked at her, then at Boone, then back at the trough. "We need to check every water point on this property," Nora said. "All of them, quietly, before anyone has reason to notice what we're looking for." She paused. "And we need to document what we find, in writing, dated and signed, before anything is disturbed." Cade looked at her. "Why the documentation?" "Because if this goes where I think it might go, you'll need proof that holds up to scrutiny. Not just what you saw, but what the ground says. What a foreman who has been on this land for years can testify to seeing." She glanced at Boone. "About what belongs here and what doesn't." Something in Boone's expression made a fractional adjustment, the kind of recalibration a person makes when they encounter something they weren't expecting to find useful. "She's right," he said to Cade. Cade said nothing. He looked at the tracks once more, and something about the way he stood when he turned away was different, straighter, resolved, with the quality of a man who has moved past, deciding into whatever comes after. "We check everything," he said, quietly, "starting now." They spent the morning moving through every water point on the property, Cade leading Nora behind him, Boone completing the three of them. Arlo and Finn were told to stay with the herd and report anything unusual, nothing more. At the second trough, nothing. At the third, the one near the west pasture gate closest to the road, the same faint, oily residue. Lighter, more diluted, but present. At the fourth, nothing. At the fifth, the most isolated point closest to the eastern property boundary, they found more than residue. The ground around the trough had been disturbed. Recently. The earth was marked by tracks that belonged to no horse on this ranch, shod differently, the impressions overlapping more than one visit, more than one night. Cade stood looking at those tracks for a long time. "Night visits," Boone said very quietly. "Looks that way. You need to document this now," Nora said. "Before rain or anything else changes it. Written descriptions, dated, signed by both of you." She looked at Boone. "What belongs to this ranch and what doesn't, you'd know that as well as anyone." "Better," Boone said simply. Cade crouched by the tracks one final time, looked at them with that complete, unhurried attention of his. Then he stood, and something had changed in the way he stood, straighter, resolved, the posture of a man who has made a decision and finished making it. "We pull that fence tomorrow," he said. "We get the water moving. We get the cattle healthy." He looked at Nora. "Everything else, one thing at a time." She nodded. He started walking back toward the ranch house, and she walked with him, not behind him, and neither of them made anything of it. After a moment, he said without looking at her, "Where did you learn to read ground like that?" "My father," she said. "He said the land is always talking. Most people just don't know the language." A pause. "He taught you well," simply said. No decoration, a statement of observed fact from a man who did not spend words on things he didn't mean. I just paid attention, she said quietly. She went to Rafferty's Supply on the 10th day. Decker drove her on the regular twice-weekly run. Having Nora along was unremarkable, just the cook from the Harlan place buying provisions. Nobody looked twice. Nobody would remember her name by the following Tuesday. That was the point. Cade had wanted to go himself. She had stopped him in the kitchen doorway that morning with 4 sentences. Silas Vane knows your face. He knows your situation. Every person in that town knows the Harlan Ranch is struggling. If you walk into Rafferty's asking about chemical compounds, the information reaches Vane before you reach the edge of town. He had looked at her steadily. And you, I'm nobody from nowhere buying cornmeal and salt. She held his gaze. That's exactly what makes me the right person to go. He had stepped back from the doorway. Rafferty's Supply was the kind of store that served as a town's unofficial clearinghouse for information. News, gossip, and speculation moved through the aisles the way water moves through low ground, finding its level without anyone directing it, pooling where the terrain allowed. Nora took her time. She read labels she already knew. She asked about thread with the concentrated interest of a woman with a specific mending task in mind. She let the conversation in the store move around her, organically landing on topics by their own momentum. It landed on the Harlan Ranch within 15 minutes. Not because she steered it, because it was already there, already a subject of active interest in a town small enough that visits from an outside party pressing a reluctant rancher to sell would not go unnoticed for long. A stout woman near the flour bin, the kind of woman who treated the accurate circulation of community information as a civic responsibility, was telling Rafferty himself that Silas Vane had been out to the Harlan place at least twice in the past several weeks. Possibly more. Vane doesn't make social calls, she said, lowering her voice in the way people lower their voices when they want to be heard more clearly. He's been working on that property for months. Anyone with eyes can see it. And Harlan won't sell, which is his right, but Vane doesn't take no for a final answer. He never has. Nora moved to the dried beans. She was listening with the relaxed attention of someone who is not listening at all. When she brought her purchases to the counter, she added one question at the end, timed between other items, casual, in the way that only careful thought produces. I need to add something to this list. We've got a problem in the south pasture. Someone at the ranch mentioned a phosphorus-based compound that works well for certain pest situations. Would you carry something like that? Rafferty frowned mildly. Phosphorus-based, that's not a standard recommendation for most field problems. More of an animal control profile, rodent situations, that sort of thing. He moved to the lower shelf and retrieved a small jar. I keep some on hand, but I don't move much of it. Have you had much call for it recently? Not usually, no. He set the jar on the counter. Had a larger order come through about 6 weeks back, but that was a special request. Not something I stock in that quantity regularly. How large an order? 22 pounds. He paused. Bulk purchase like that's unusual for this type of compound. Customer wanted it filled quickly and quietly. He stopped, heard himself say it. Looked at her. Nora's face remained exactly where she needed it. Pleasant, mildly interested, the expression of a woman having a perfectly ordinary conversation about supplies. For the pasture problem, I'd probably go with a standard option rather than that profile, Rafferty said, a fraction more carefully than before. Of course, she said pleasantly. I'll take your recommendation. She bought everything on her list. She thanked Rafferty with genuine warmth. She walked to the wagon at the pace of a woman who has finished her errands and has no particular reason to hurry. She climbed up beside Decker. Get what you needed? He asked. Yes, she said. I believe so. He clicked the horses forward. Nora kept her hands folded still in her lap for the entire ride back. She managed this. But inside her chest, something was moving fast. The feeling of pieces connecting, of a shape, becoming fully and finally clear of understanding, arriving with the cold certainty of water finding level ground. 22 pounds. 6 weeks ago. Quickly and quietly. She told Cade the moment she walked through the door. He was in the office. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She closed the door behind her, stood in front of his desk, and told him everything: the woman at the flower bin, what Rafferty had said, the compound, the quantity, the specific phrase he had used, and then appeared to regret. Cade did not move while she talked. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on her, and he listened with the complete attention of a man who has decided that what is being said matters and intends to treat it accordingly. When she finished, he was quiet. 6 weeks ago, he said. Yes. He said it again, but differently, working through it, laying each piece against the next. The Dawson contract fell through 8 weeks ago. My 2 best hands left for the railroad 7 weeks ago, same week, and I thought it was just bad timing. His voice was flat and precise. The hay burned 5 weeks ago. A silence settled in the office. He was purchasing the compound before the fire, Cade said. He already knew what he was going to do. He'd already lost me the contract and the hands, and he had the compound ready, and then he burned the hay. The knuckles of his hands went white against the desk's surface. He's been running this for months, while I was standing in my own yard thinking I was losing to drought. His jaw worked. I have been a fool, he said. It was not self-pity. It was the sound of a hard, honest reckoning of intelligence being applied without flinching to a painful truth. Nora did not argue with him. She did not offer comfort because this was not a moment for comfort. You trusted that your neighbor wouldn't do this, she said. You were wrong about this particular man. That's not the same thing. She sat down at the edge of his desk without being invited, reached for the pen and paper he kept beside the ledger, and began to write. She wrote her account of everything Rafferty had said, specific words, quantities, the phrase quickly and quietly dated, and signed it at the bottom. While she wrote, Cade worked through his own notes across the desk. 2 people in a small room in the late afternoon, working in the focused silence of people who have arrived at the same understanding and know what needs to happen next. It should have felt stranger than it did. It did not feel strange at all. On the 14th day, Inspector Dodd arrived. He came up the drive on a county horse with a small badge on his coat and the practiced pleasantness of a man whose job required him to deliver difficult news while appearing to find the necessity of it regrettable. There had been a complaint filed, a water diversion claim, an allegation that recent modifications to the Harlan Ranch had redirected a natural water flow affecting neighboring land. Cade was in the yard. He went very still when Dodd stated the nature of his visit. Nora saw it from the kitchen window. She dried her hands. She did not stay in the kitchen. She walked across the yard and positioned herself beside Cade before Dodd had finished laying out the complaint. Mr. Dodd, she said with the careful courtesy she had learned worked better than directness when dealing with men who held minor official power. I don't mean to interrupt, but I believe I can speak to what was done and why, if that would be useful to your inquiry. I was present throughout the entire process. Dodd looked at her. A quick assessing look, the automatic look of a man who has not yet decided whether a woman standing in a ranch yard is relevant to his business. And you are Nora Holt. I work here. A pause. I was the one who initially identified the issue with the fence line. I can walk you through the reasoning, and I can show you the maps we've been working from. Dodd's expression shifted slightly. What maps would those be? The property survey, the original topographic records. She turned toward the house with the calm of a woman who is fully prepared for whatever comes next. Please come inside. She spread the old map across the kitchen table, and she talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the natural gradient of the ridge visible in the elevation markings, if you knew how to read contour lines. She talked about the original water channel, how it would have moved along the base of the ridge and fed the eastern portion of the property before any fence existed over it. She talked about the fence's age, the depth of its posts, the decades over which those posts had settled into the substrate and compressed the channel beneath them, blocking what had been moving freely for generations before anyone drove the first post into this ground. She was precise about the elevation markings. She pointed to specific contour lines and explained what they implied about pre-existing water movement in terms that were clear without being condescending. She did not rush. She did not hedge. She presented the information as documented fact because in her bones, built from years of watching and learning and inheriting her father's gift for reading the earth, it was. She used the word hydrology twice and explained it both times as though for Dodd's benefit. Cade stood to her left, threw out one hand on the table, saying almost nothing. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a solid structure in close proximity, not leaning against it, but knowing it is there. When she finished, Dodd looked at the map. He looked at his notes. He looked at her with a different quality of attention than he had brought to the yard. "You'll have a formal survey completed by when?" he asked. "End of the month," Nora said. No hesitation, no flicker. "I'll need to see it before I can close the inquiry." "Of course, we'll have it ready." Dodd closed his notebook, stood, and thanked them with the careful neutrality of a man who had arrived with one expectation and was leaving with something slightly different. He walked out to his horse and rode away, and the sound of him going was one of the more satisfying sounds Nora had heard in a long time. Then Cade looked at her. "We don't have a survey," he said. "I know. You told a county inspector we'd have one by end of month. I told him we'd have it ready, so we need to hire a surveyor in the next 3 weeks. She held his gaze. "Dodd came here because Vane sent him expecting you to be caught off guard. Men who are caught off guard either get angry or go quiet. Either way, they lose the exchange." She paused. "So I made sure you weren't caught off guard." He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that comes before something. She could feel it gathering the way weather gathers pressure, building in a specific direction. "You think like a lawyer," he said. The second time he had said it. It landed the same way, not quite a compliment, but a recognition of a specific intelligence being applied to a specific problem. "I think like someone who lost a farm because she trusted that being right would be enough," she said. It wasn't. Something moved in his face, that recognition again, deep and particular. Then, from outside, Arlo's voice cut across the yard at a volume and register that meant something was wrong, and Cade was already moving, and Nora was one step behind him. And the thing that had been building between them dissolved into the urgent press of boots on dry ground and voices calling across the yard, and whatever had been about to happen went back to wherever such things go when the land decides it isn't finished with you yet. The 2 cattle in the south pen were down, but not dead. Nora established this within 30 seconds of reaching them, crouching beside the nearest animal with her hands reading what the animal's body had to tell her. "Same as the calf?" Cade asked from the other side. "Similar, not identical. This one's been sick longer. It started before today." She pressed her palm flat against the animal's side. "These 2 got a lower dose or got it from a more diluted source. They've been fighting it for days." Cade stood. "Which means it wasn't the South Trough. Not recently." The implication assembled itself in his face. "There's a 3rd source we haven't found." Nora looked at the east fence line, at the direction it ran toward the property boundary. She had been thinking about the pipe configuration since she first identified it, and now she looked at it with the particular focus of someone for whom a possibility has just become a near certainty. "The feed pipe," she said. "The one that runs from the upper creek to the south pen. How much of it runs exposed along the east boundary?" Boone, who had arrived at the pen gate with the silent punctuality that was simply his nature, said, "Quarter mile before it hits the holding tank." "And the east boundary, how close does the road run to it at that point?" "Close enough that a man on horseback doesn't need to dismount." "Then someone never needed to set foot on your land," Nora said. "They could access that pipe from outside the fence entirely. From the roadside." The 3 of them looked at each other. Cade looked at Arlo. "Separate these 2 from the rest. Fresh water from the main well, only nothing from any trough or feed line until I say otherwise." He was already moving. "Finn, ride to Doc Pruitt in town. Tell him I need him today. Not tomorrow. Today." Finn was gone before the sentence was finished. Cade looked at Nora. "You don't have to come," he said. "I know," she said, and walked with him toward the east fence line. They found the contamination point in under 10 minutes. The wooden channel protecting the exposed section of pipe had been pried open, not carefully, not with any effort to conceal what had been done. The same residue they had found in the South Trough was visible here, more concentrated, less diluted. The work of someone who had stopped taking care or who had decided that care was no longer necessary. Cade stood over it with his hands at his sides. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual, controlled stillness. It had passed through control into something colder on the other side. The stillness of a man who has assembled the full picture and is looking at it clearly for the first time. "He's escalating," Nora said. "Yes. Because the survey deadline worried him. Because Dodd came out here and didn't shut you down the way Vane expected. He knows he's losing time, so he's pushing harder." "Yes." "Cade." She waited until he looked at her. "This can't be handled quietly anymore. This is deliberate criminal damage. Documented damage. You need to report it to someone with the authority to act on it, someone outside this county if necessary." His jaw tightened. "The county sheriff?" "I know about the county sheriff," she said. She had heard enough since arriving to understand the local landscape of loyalties. "But you need the record, regardless. If this becomes a federal matter, and I believe it will, you need documented proof that you reported what was being done to you. A paper trail showing systematic targeting. You need it in writing dated, and you need to go today." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think like a lawyer," he said, for the third time. But this time it had a different quality, not observation, but something closer to gratitude. "I think like someone who lost a farm, because the people who owned it trusted that being right would be enough," she said. "It wasn't. Go today, Cade, and don't go alone." He turned to Boone. "Ride with me this afternoon." "Already planning on it," Boone said. Doc Pruitt arrived before Cade and Boone returned. He was a compact man past 60 with sharp eyes and the economy of movement that comes from decades of doing difficult work efficiently. He examined both sick animals with methodical precision, asked Nora precise questions, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of a professional who has identified a reliable source of information. "Phosphorus compound," he said when he finished. "Agricultural profile. Used in pest control or certain chemical applications, consistent toxicity signature." He straightened. "How many contamination points have you confirmed?" 3, Nora said. "There may be more we haven't checked." He looked at her with the assessing look she had grown familiar with. "You work here?" "Yes." 2 weeks. He nodded slowly. "These two will recover the dilution they received. Wasn't concentrated enough to be fatal. But if you hadn't caught this today..." He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. "Someone needs to watch them through the night." "That'll be me," Nora said. He went to write up his findings. Nora stayed with the animals. The afternoon moved around the ranch with the quality of a day that has asked too much of everyone in it. Cade and Boone came back in the late afternoon. Nora read the outcome before either of them spoke. She read it in Boone's face, the expression of a man who has eaten something disagreeable and is managing it with dignity. She read it in Cade's, the particular exhaustion of receiving the disappointment you anticipated, which is somehow harder than surprise. She set coffee on the table and sat across from Cade. "Sheriff took the report," he said. "Wrote it down. Said he'd look into it." "But," she said, "he and Vane have been friendly for a long time," Boone said, wrapping both hands around his cup. "Same church, same understanding of how this county ought to operate." Nora looked at Cade. Doc Pruitt identified the compound. Phosphorus-based agricultural. She kept her voice steady. "The Rafferty ledger, the actual written entry, not my account of a conversation, that's a different category of evidence entirely. Official documentation compelled through proper channels. Rafferty won't volunteer it." "He won't have to," she said. "Someone with federal authority wouldn't need Rafferty's cooperation, only his records. A federal inquiry into land fraud supersedes any preference Rafferty has for not inconveniencing his customers." She paused. "Is there any path to federal jurisdiction here?" Boone set down his cup. "My cousin worked land registry in Amarillo. Still has contacts in the federal land office." Cade looked at him. "Water rights tampering across property lines," Nora said. documented criminal damage to livestock, systematic targeting over multiple months. That's not a county matter. That's larger than whatever arrangement exists between the county sheriff and Silas Vane. She met Cade's eyes. "Write to your cousin tonight." She reached for the pen without being asked, pulled a fresh sheet toward her, and began writing her full account, the Rafferty conversation word for word, as close as memory could reconstruct it, dated and signed at the bottom. Cade sat down across from her with his own notes and worked in silence. For a time, the only sound in the office was the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional turn of a page. Two people working at the same table on opposite sides of the same problem in the quiet shared purpose of people who have stopped needing to narrate what they're doing. Boone sent the letter that evening. 3 days later, the cousin wrote back. He had contacts in the federal land office in Amarillo. He knew the process and the people. He would make inquiries about sending a federal investigator to Harlan County if Cade could provide documentation, the physical evidence of tampering Doc Pruitt's professional assessment of the compound, the signed witness accounts, and any official supply record that could be obtained through proper channels. They were building something. Methodically, deliberately, the way you build anything meant to hold weight over time. And then, on the 18th day, Silas Vane came back. Alone this time. No lawyer, no hired men. Just Vane driving his own wagon up the drive at mid-morning, with the particular deliberate calm of a man who has decided that the time for intermediaries is over. Nora saw him from the kitchen window. She sent Arlo for Cade before Vane had finished climbing down from the seat. Then she dried her hands and went outside. She stood beside Boone in the yard and waited. Vane looked at her when she came out, the same quick dismissal he had given her on every previous occasion. The rapid visual calculation that concluded she was not a significant variable and moved immediately on. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about it from the first day she stood in this yard. Cade came across the yard at his steady pace and stopped several feet from Vane. Vane opened with a different register than before. The smooth management was still present, but something more direct was moving underneath it now. Something that had given up on the performance and was trying for once to speak plainly. "I think we've been talking past each other," he said. "I don't believe we've been talking much at all," Cade said. "I want to make this right. I want to sit down man to man and put a real number on the table. Something that actually works." "There's no number," Cade said. Vane looked out at the north pasture. The grass was fractionally greener than 3 weeks ago. The cattle were carrying slightly more weight, not recovered, not yet, but no longer declining. He saw it. She watched him see it and watched his jaw tighten as the information registered against whatever he had expected to find here. "Cade," he said. His voice had quieted, more direct, almost reasonable, which was the most dangerous version of Silas Vane she had encountered. "I understand the attachment. This was your father's land. I respect that. But the situation—" "A federal investigator was in this kitchen 4 days ago," Cade said. The yard went quiet in a specific way. "He has my documentation, signed witness statements. He is in the process of obtaining the Rafferty supply ledger through official federal channels this week. Each word placed exactly where it needed to be. You know what's in that ledger." Vane went very still. The stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him has moved, that his position is not what he believed it was. "That's a serious implication," he said carefully. "I haven't implied anything," Cade said. "I've told you what exists. What you do with that information is your own concern." One step forward. "Get off my land." Quiet, flat, without heat. The finality of a door at the end of a long hallway closing without drama. Vane looked at Cade. He looked at Boone. And then he looked at Nora. This time it was a real look. Not the quick dismissal of every previous visit, but the look of a man who is reassessing too late, and he knew it was too late, the weight of something he had categorized as irrelevant from the beginning, and is only now fully understanding the cost of that error. She held his gaze without speaking, without moving. She simply let him look and let him understand what he was looking at: a woman who had been on this property for 18 days and had in that time quietly and methodically dismantled every advantage he thought he had built. He looked away first. He climbed back into his wagon, and he left at a noticeably faster pace than he had arrived, which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. Cade stood in the yard and watched the wagon until it was gone. She stood beside him. "He'll try something else," she said. "I know. He's out of time and he knows it. That makes him more dangerous, not less." "I know that too." He turned and looked at her directly. "Which is why I need Fenn here, the federal investigator, as soon as Boone's cousin can arrange it." Marshal Fenn arrived on a Wednesday. He came alone, which surprised Cade. He came with a briefcase full of documents, which did not. He was a quiet man of around 50. A government-issue coat, a face that gave away nothing by habit rather than by effort, and the economy of movement of someone who had spent a long career doing difficult work and had learned to conserve everything that wasn't strictly necessary to the task at hand. Nora had coffee on the table before he finished tying his horse at the rail. He noticed that. His eyes moved through the kitchen when he entered cataloging, storing, organizing. He was good at his job. She understood that within 5 minutes of watching him work. He examined the documentation with methodical care. Doc Pruitt's written assessment of the compound and its toxicity profile. Nora's signed witness account of the Rafferty conversation. Specific words, the quantity, the phrase, quickly and quietly. The dated described records of each contamination point, signed by Cade and Boone. The written descriptions of the tracks at the east fence line. He read Nora's account twice. "Miss Holt," he said without looking up from the page. "Everything in this account, you're prepared to stand behind it officially?" "Yes." "In a federal proceeding?" "Yes," she said, steadier this time. He looked up then. A different quality of look from the cataloging, something that was measuring something other than detail. "All right," he said. He set the account into the briefcase and placed his hands on the table. "Here is where we stand," he said. His voice shifted into a precise, organized register, the voice of a man presenting findings without editorializing. "The Consolidated Land and Cattle Trust has a history that our office has been watching. 3 properties in 8 years. 2 of them sold under circumstances we consider irregular. Water disputes, livestock losses, 1 fire. He looked between Cade and Nora. "We have been looking for a case with sufficient documentation to move on this organization. What you have here is close. It may be sufficient." "Maybe," Cade said. "Close cases become sufficient with 1 additional piece. The Rafferty supply ledger, not a witness account of a conversation, but the actual written entry in the store's records. £22 the transaction date, the name or company under which it was billed. Combined with everything you have here, that closes it." He closed the briefcase. "I can compel that record. A federal inquiry into land fraud supersedes any preference Rafferty has for discretion regarding his customers." He stood and buttoned his coat. 10 days, possibly 2 weeks. In the meantime, do not escalate. Do not confront Vane. Do not create noise in town. Let me work. "And if Vane moves again while you're doing it," Cade said, "document it immediately and contact me." Fenn paused at the door. "Mr. Harlan, I have looked at this property and at what you have built here." He chose his next words with the care of a man who did not spend them carelessly. "I would like to see you keep it." He left. The kitchen held the shape of what he had said for a long time after his horse cleared the yard. Then Arlo from the doorway. "Are we going to be all right?" Cade looked at him. "Yes," he said. The way he said everything that mattered directly without hedging, as straight as a fence post driven deep. Arlo nodded and went back to work. The 10 days Fenn had asked for were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you know something is moving but cannot see it, cannot push it, and can only keep your own house in order and trust that the larger structure will hold. Nora kept the kitchen. She kept the water checks, the twice-daily inspection of every trough and feed line on the property which she had taken on without being asked and continued without being told to stop. She kept the cattle records because Cade had begun asking for her observations in the evenings, and the records needed to exist in writing, dated and precise. She kept other things, too. She kept the awareness of how Cade moved through the ranch now, which was different from how he had moved when she arrived. He still didn't talk much, that hadn't changed, and she didn't expect it to. But the quality of his silence had changed. It no longer had the texture of distance. It had the texture of a man who is thinking seriously and trusts the person beside him enough not to fill the space with noise. He asked her opinion on the herd rotation schedule. On a letter he was drafting to the Dawson Cattle Company, reopening the conversation about the contract they had withdrawn. He slid the draft across the kitchen table one evening without comment, and she read it and looked up. "The third paragraph reads like an apology," she said. He looked at the letter. "It's an explanation. For circumstances that were not your fault. You don't explain yourself to a buyer you want to come back. You tell them what you have now that you didn't have before." She pointed to the specific sentences. "These two especially." He was quiet. "Rewrite it," he said. He pushed the paper toward her. "If you think it needs it." She rewrote the third paragraph. He read it again, then folded the letter carefully and addressed the envelope himself. The next morning he gave it to Decker. Something about how that had worked, two people dividing a task without negotiating it, falling naturally into the shape of each other's competencies, stayed with Nora for the rest of the day. She understood what it meant. She had understood it for some time. She was simply not yet ready to examine it too directly, the way you avoid looking directly at something bright until you are certain your eyes can handle it. On the 9th night, she smelled it before she saw anything. She was doing the late check on the cattle the last round before bed, a habit she had maintained every night since the animals in the south pen fell sick. The night was cold and clear, with the particular clarity of a Texas sky and the dry season stars close and sharp. She was at the far edge of the east pen when the smell reached her. Kerosene. Faint in the cold air, but unmistakable, a specific petroleum sharpness with no business being on this property at this hour. She did not stop to think. She turned and ran, not calling out, back through the yard, through the back door, down the hall to Cade's door. She knocked hard once, said his name. He opened the door in under 5 seconds. She could see in his face that he had not been sleeping deeply. Some part of him had been waiting not for this specific night, but for some version of this night. "East fence line," she said. "Kerosene." He was dressed and passed her before she finished the sentence. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not orderly. Cade crossed the yard at speed, and Boone was already at the barn. She had stopped wondering how Boone always knew where to be, and had simply accepted it as a feature of the man. And the three figures moving along the east fence line heard them coming and ran. 2 made it back across the property boundary and into the darkness beyond. The third did not. Arlo, who was 19 years old and had apparently also not been sleeping, came around the corner of the south pen and intersected the third man near the fence post. He had young legs and the righteous fury of someone who had watched his employer's cattle suffer for weeks and had finally found a person physically responsible for it. The man went down and stayed down, and Arlo sat on him with his full weight and looked up at Cade, arriving with an expression that was slightly breathless and entirely satisfied. "Got one," he said. The kerosene had been poured along a section of dry fence rail, but had not been lit. Boone was already on it, kicking dry earth over the soaked wood with the efficiency of a man who knows that in a fire situation, the first 30 seconds are the only seconds that matter. Finn was sent for the deputy Finn had briefed before leaving, the one with no social ties to Silas Vane and no stake in protecting anyone connected to him. Nora stood at the back door with the long kitchen knife in her hand. Not for any heroic purpose. She had taken it because holding something solid and real helped her think clearly in situations that required clear thinking, and she stood just inside the door where she could hear everything in the yard and be heard from the yard if it came to that. Arlo and Finn materialized in the kitchen doorway. Young faces pale with the adrenaline of an event that had moved faster than their ability to process it. "Stay here," she said quietly. If you hear anything from a direction that doesn't make sense, not from the people I know, you ride for town. Both of you. Understood?" They nodded. Cade came back across the yard 20 minutes later. He stopped when he saw her standing in the doorway with a knife at her side. He looked at the knife. He looked at her. "Were you planning to use that?" he said. "I was planning to have options," she said. Something broke open in his face. It was not amusement exactly. It was more complicated than that, more weighted. Everything that had been building over the past several weeks, moving across his features simultaneously faster than she could separate it into its parts. He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the dust in his hair and the particular set of his jaw that meant he had made a decision and was choosing his words around it carefully. "Nora," he said. The way he said her name was entirely different from every previous time. It carried something specific and deliberate, something he was choosing to place there. She looked up at him. "When this is finished," he said, "when Vane is dealt with and the survey is filed and the cattle are healthy." He stopped, started again more directly. "I want you to stay, not because the work requires it." He held her gaze. "You know what I mean." The kitchen behind her was very quiet. She was aware in a distant and slightly exasperated part of her attention that Arlo and Finn were doing an extremely unconvincing impression of not listening from approximately 6 feet away. "I know what you mean," she said carefully. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said. "I'm asking you to know that the question is there, that it isn't the moment talking." He paused. "I've thought about it every day since the map. Since you stood at that table and held the whole thing together without anyone asking you to." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know the question is there," she said. He nodded. "Once." Then he turned back toward the fence line to assess the damage with Boone, because there was still work to be done and the night was not finished, and that was simply who Cade Harlan was, a man who dealt with what was in front of him and trusted that the larger things would keep. Nora stood in the doorway with the knife still in her hand. The coal she had been carrying carefully for years, that small, stubborn thing kept alive through 3 years of roads and difficult rooms and work that never quite became a life, burned brighter than it had in longer than she could clearly remember. She set the knife down on the counter. She went back to work. Marshal Fenn returned the following noon. He stood in the yard and looked at the kerosene-soaked fence rail that Cade and Boone had sectioned off and documented that morning. He examined the man being held in the barn under Boone's watchful attention, a hired man who would not say who had sent him and did not need to. He read Nora's account of the previous night, written at the kitchen table before sunrise, while every detail was still immediate and precise. He read it without expression. Then he set a document on the kitchen table. "I have the Rafferty ledger," he said. Cade looked up. "The entry is there. 22 pounds of phosphorus compound purchased for cash, billed to a supply company that traces directly and unambiguously to Consolidated Land and Cattle Trust." Fenn set his hands flat on the table. "Combined with what you have assembled here, the contamination evidence, Doc Pruitt's professional assessment, the signed witness accounts, last night's attempted arson with a witness now in custody, we have sufficient cause for federal action." The kitchen held the weight of that for a moment. "Sufficient for what exactly?" Cade said. "Warrants. Vane and 2 principles of consolidated criminal tampering with water infrastructure, deliberate harm to livestock, attempted destruction of property, and federal land fraud. The pattern across multiple properties over 8 years makes the fraud case straightforward." Fenn looked at Cade directly. "This will move quickly now. It may become public before the proceedings conclude. I want you prepared for that." "Do what needs to be done," Cade said. Fenn closed the briefcase. He looked at Nora. "Miss Holt." His tone had a quality that existed somewhere between professional acknowledgement and something that in a less contained man might have been called admiration. "The account you provided, the work at Rafferty's, the documentation you built from the first week you were here." He paused. "That is what gave this case its foundation." Nora looked back at him steadily. "Mr. Harlan built this case," she said. "He didn't sell when Vane wanted him to sell. He didn't quit when everything around him was failing. He kept the land and the cattle and didn't stop working. She paused. I just paid attention. Fen held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out to his horse, and the sound of him riding away carried something with it, the particular quality of resolution of things moving now in the direction they ought to move, finally, and without the possibility of being stopped. Silas Vane was arrested on a Friday morning. Nora was not there when it happened. She was at the ranch in the kitchen doing what she had done every morning for 3 weeks. She heard about it from Decker, who arrived with the weekly supply run, wearing the expression of a man carrying significant news, and was aware of his own importance in the delivery of it. Federal officers had been waiting at Vane's property before the sun was fully up. His lawyer arrived within the hour, but by then the documentation was in official hands, and the lawyer's arrival changed nothing of material consequence. Rafferty, Decker reported, was cooperating extensively. Had visited Fenn's temporary county office twice already, volunteering information with the sudden enthusiasm of a man who has decided that distance from a failing enterprise is its own form of self-preservation. Town's divided about it, Decker said, wrapping his hands around the coffee Nora set in front of him. Half claim they never trusted Vane. Other half says they're shocked. That's usually how it goes, Nora said. When Cade came in from the morning's work, she told him. He sat down at the kitchen table and was still for a moment, not the controlled stillness she had come to know, but a different kind. The stillness of a man who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and is only now beginning to feel what it means to release the grip. It's not over, she said, because she knew him well enough to know what the silence meant. There'll be proceedings. It'll take time. I know, but the immediate threat is finished. He looked at her. His face in the morning light was the most unguarded she had seen it, not vulnerable, not soft, but open in the way that only exhaustion and relief together can open a person. Because of you, he said. She shook her head. Because of Boone and Arlo and Finn, because of Doc Pruitt and Marshall Fenn, because of Decker, who drove me to town without asking why. She met his eyes. And because of you, Cade. This is your land. You didn't sell it when Vane wanted you to. You didn't walk away when everything was pointing toward walking away. I nearly did, he said, before you came. I didn't let myself say it, but I was running out of reasons to keep fighting. The kitchen was quiet. What changed? She said. He looked at her directly, without the inventory look, without the assessing look, with the look of a man who has made a decision and is saying it plainly. You know what changed, he said. She did. She had known for some time. She had been carrying the knowledge of it carefully, the way you carry something fragile across uneven ground, not gripping it too tightly, not looking at it too directly, simply keeping it safe until the ground became level enough to set it down properly. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying I know exactly what this is or where it goes, she said, but I know that. I'm not going anywhere, Cade, if that's something you can work with. He held her gaze. That's everything I'm asking for, he said. That evening after supper was cleared and the boys had gone to bed, and Boone had disappeared to the barn as he did most evenings, Arlo came to the kitchen door. He stood there with his hat in both hands and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Tight-faced, carrying something he needed to put down. Miss Holt, he said. When you first got here, Finn and me, we said some things. Not to you, but about you. He stopped, worked the brim of his hat. About whether someone like you belonged on a working ranch. She looked at him. I know what you said, she told him. Not unkindly, just plainly. He flushed. I thought you might. He met her eyes with visible effort. I was wrong. What you did with the fence, with the water, with all of it. The way you figured out what was happening to the troughs before any of us even knew to look. He shook his head. My father ran cattle his whole life, and he couldn't have done what you did. Arlo, she said, I don't need you to admire me. I just need you to work beside me when it counts. He nodded slowly at first, then more firmly. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now go to bed. We've got an early start tomorrow. He went. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment and let herself feel it, the way she had let herself feel the water moving, and the satisfaction of watching the cattle find their way to it, and the look on Cade's face at the fence line when he understood that the land had been giving them the answer all along. She felt it completely without diminishing it, and then she folded it away and went back to work. The surveyor came the following week and spent 2 full days walking the property with Cade and Boone, producing documents that confirmed in precise official language what Nora had read in the land with her hands and her eyes, and the knowledge her father had spent years building into her. The water channel, its origin in the natural aquifer beneath the North Ridge, its pre-existing course running east along the base of the ridge and feeding the eastern portion of the property, a course older than any fence, older than any land, claim moving exactly where it had always been meant to move until a line of deep-driven fence posts stopped it from doing so. When the survey was complete, Cade spread it across the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Nora. She had been reading the document over his shoulder. When she looked up, she found him already watching her. "Look at what this place could be," he said. It was not only what he was saying, and the way she looked back at him was not only about the survey on the table between them. "I'm looking," she said. 3 weeks after Vane's arrest, a letter arrived from the Dawson Cattle Company. They had heard about the water. They had heard about the federal case. News moved fast in ranch country, especially news involving a land fraud operation with multiple victims across multiple counties. They were interested in revisiting the supply contract. They would send a representative the following month. Cade read the letter at the supper table. "Set it down," Finn said. "Is that good news?" "Yes," Cade said. Arlo grinned wide enough that it looked permanent. Boone said with a measured satisfaction that was as close to celebration as he got. "About time." He broke ground near the east pasture in the 2nd week of October. A small structure. Solid walls of good timber, a proper stove set into the north-facing wall, and a window positioned at the exact angle that would give a clear view of the ridge line, the long dark spine of rock and earth at whose foot the water had been waiting through all those years, patient and blocked and real, until someone finally thought to look. He showed it to her on the afternoon the walls went up. He didn't explain it. He walked her out in the early evening light and stood back and let her look. She stood in what would be the doorway. Through the open space where the north window would go, the ridge was visible, the exact place where she had crouched in the heat of a Texas afternoon 6 weeks ago and pressed her palm against cool, damp earth and felt the certainty move through her like a current she had not known she was waiting for. "The window faces north," she said. "So you can see the ridge," he said, "where the water starts." She turned to look at him. The evening light was doing what it does in October in Texas, falling long and warm across the land, showing everything with the particular honesty that only certain hours of certain days produce. She could see the exhaustion in his face that had not fully left it yet, and the quality of relief that had been settling into him in slow increments over the past weeks. And something else that had no clean name, but that she had been watching build since the first morning. She pressed her palm against that fence-line earth, and something between them had shifted without either of them deciding to shift it. "Yes," she said. Not to the question he had asked out loud. To the question he had been asking since the first day she walked across his yard and refused to be helped down from anything. "Yes," she said again. "Because some things are worth saying twice." Cade Harlan, who did not waste words or gestures or anything that mattered, reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. One careful, deliberate motion. And then he turned to look at his land. The land that had nearly been taken from him. The land that was whole again. The land that the water was moving across in the gathering dark. At this very moment, running east along the channel. It had always been meant to follow with a quietness about him that was not the emptiness it had once been. Something full, something settled, something that had finally found the shape it was always built to hold. By October, the Harlan Ranch had 47 healthy head of cattle and a signed contract with the Dawson Cattle Company for spring delivery. By October, Boone had hired 2 new hands, young men with good references and steady temperaments, and the ranch had taken on the quality of a working place, rather than a place working against its own survival. The proceedings against Vane and the consolidated principles moved through the federal system with the slow, inexorable authority of things that have been properly documented. Rafferty testified. Doc Pruitt submitted his written assessment. The man Arlo had caught at the fence line agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges and named the parties who had hired him. The case against Consolidated reached beyond Harlan County. 2 other properties, 2 other families who had been pressed and damaged and who now had documentation and a federal proceeding to point to. None of it was quick. All of it was real. Nora kept the kitchen. She kept the records. She kept the late checks on the cattle. Though the cattle were healthy now and the checks were no longer urgent, she kept them anyway because paying attention was not something she had ever been willing to stop doing, simply because the immediate crisis had passed. She and Cade sat on the porch some evenings when the work was done and the land had gone quiet. They sat without the need to fill the silence, which was the particular luxury of 2 people who have stopped needing to prove themselves to each other. Sometimes he talked about what he wanted to do with the East pasture, or about a letter he had received from a cattle breeder in West Texas, or about something Boone had said that morning that struck him as either wise or characteristically dry. Sometimes she talked about the North Ridge and what she thought could be done to develop the water flow further, or about a preservation technique she wanted to try with the fall slaughter. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and that was the best of it. One evening, sitting in the cooling air with the last of the light leaving the ridge, Cade said, "My father told me once that land is only as good as the people who stay on it." She looked out at the dark settling over the property. "He was right," she said. "He was right about most things." A pause. "He would have liked you." She felt that land somewhere behind her sternum. "How do you know?" "Because you argue with me," he said. "He always said the people worth keeping around are the ones who say what they actually think." She almost smiled. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, "for the next time I think you're wrong about something." "You won't have to wait long," he said. And then they were both quiet, and the night moved around them, and the land lay under the vast Texas sky doing what land does when it has been returned to itself, healing slow and deep and permanent, putting down what it needs for the season ahead and the seasons after that. The water ran east through the channel they had cleared. It ran through the night and through the following morning and through all the days that came after, past the eastern troughs and the south pasture and on toward the lower acreage that would by the following spring be green in a way it had not been green in living memory. The cattle moved toward it in the dark without being directed, because cattle know what they need and go toward it when they are finally allowed to. Nora stood in the doorway of what would be her home. The north window was in now, and the ridge was visible through it exactly as Cade had positioned it, the long dark line of stone and earth where the water started its journey, where she had crouched in the heat of an August afternoon and pressed her palm against the cool secret the land had been keeping, and felt the certainty move through her like something she had always known and simply hadn't had a place to put yet. She had come to this ranch with nothing. A canvas bag, a face that gave away nothing. A notice she had pulled off a board in a sun-bleached town that said no references required. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and because she had learned in the specific hard school of losing everything once that the only thing left to do when you have nothing left to lose is to go straight at the hardest thing in front of you and see what it requires. This is what it had required. She looked out at the ridge. She thought about her father, about his hands on the earth of their old farm, about the way he had talked to the land as though it could hear him, because in his experience it more or less could. She thought about the drought that had taken him and the debt that had taken the farm after him, and she thought about the long road between that loss and this doorway, and she let herself feel the full weight of the distance, not to grieve it, but to understand how it had made her exactly the person that this land and this man had needed her to be. The water ran east. The cattle moved toward it in the dark. And Nora Holt, who had arrived on a supply wagon on a day when a barn was burning, who had run into the smoke because she was not the kind of woman who waited at safe distances for things to resolve themselves, stood in the doorway of her home on land that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. and knew with the same bone-deep certainty she had felt the first time she pressed her palm against that cool, dark earth at the foot of the North Ridge, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and that she was never leaving again. Based on the summary, the complete story, The Water Beneath Harlan Land, was written across 3 parts, totaling 19,500 words. The conversation ended after completing the full rewrite. I'll now write the complete story, directly incorporating all the fixes described in the summary.